How do we heal intergenerational trauma? Welcome everyone to the Cope and Chill podcast, where every Tuesday we explore practical approaches to self-care and self-healing for better emotional and mental health and well-being. And I'm your host, Ron Martin. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching or listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you are listening via audio podcast, please leave us a comment. Doing these things will help our show to be seen and heard by more and more people and helps us to get better all the way around. Trauma is when we experience something that is overwhelmingly distressing, painful, and disturbing. This can come from an event, a series of events, or prolonged exposures over time. And within families, trauma can come from all forms of abuse, sexual, physical, or even emotional. It can also come from experiences we have with our environment, such as harsh conditions endured during war, economic hardships, or even climate or weather-related catastrophes, just to name a few. But how do we respond to trauma? How do we cope with the pain and distress? Often, we adopt behaviors, mindsets, and other relationships to the trauma that work for us in the moment, that help us survive. They may not be the most healthy, skilled, or compassionate ways of handling these things, but under the circumstances, they work. They help us survive what we are experiencing. For an example of a traumatic response, consider this. Perhaps a relationship has hurt us badly, and so we close ourselves off from some types of relationships, because closing ourselves off protects us. It keeps us from getting hurt again, or so we believe. But sometimes we carry these responses to trauma or coping skills with us, and they shape the way we relate to the world long after the trauma, the thing that causes us the pain and distress, is gone. What happens if we pass that way of relating to the world to our children? For example, what happens if we unconsciously teach our children to be guarded and closed off as a way of protecting themselves, even though they haven't experienced anything like what we have experienced? Are we helping them? Are we really preparing them in the best way possible for the world in which they will live in by teaching them our trauma responses? Generational or intergenerational trauma is when we not only pass our trauma responses down to our children, but also the traumas themselves. Think about cycles of abuse that occur between multiple generations in the same family. Toxic and dysfunctional behaviors that were learned by us as children, and then, because of a lack of awareness and knowledge of more helpful ways of doing things, we pass them on to our children. This is generational trauma, as best as I can explain it. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of healing generational trauma with author and life coach Jenna Lee. Jenna is a former English teacher turned author and certified coach who has been seen on ABC 15 and featured in New York Weekly, The American Reporter, and others. She's been studying spirituality since high school and has lived like a monk in South Korea for 5 years. She uses compassionate coaching and meditative inquiry to dissolve blocks as they come up in pursuit of clients' goals. Her ideal clients are women who want to develop more self-love and those interested in spirituality. Her coaching program, Embrace Your Brilliance, is open now and can be found at jennalotus.com. You can also find her on Instagram at XO Jenna J. Lee. You can find these and other links in the show notes. Join us today as we explore how to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. And as always, please like and subscribe or leave a comment wherever you're joining us from. Thank you. And now, here's Jenna Lee. Hey there. Welcome, everyone, to the Cope and Chill podcast. I'm Ron Martin, and I'm here with Jenna Lee. And Jenna, you and I had a brief conversation before, and we talked about one of the reasons why I was really interested in talking to you is because you were able to speak to the whole idea of generational trauma, what it is, how it impacts us. And what I'd like you to do, or to help our audience with, is just a general understanding of what it is, and then we'll go from there. So what do we mean by generational trauma, and how does it show up in our lives?
Okay, so what I mean by generational trauma when I talk about it is less the psychological phenomenon and more the energetic part. So our bodies are energy. We appear solid, but we're actually, waves and particles and all that. So when we're young, and if you believe in past lives, maybe from a past life, when we're young, we are energetically influenced by our parents, and they have certain belief systems and, political views, like ideas about how to raise children or ideas about the world that they pass on to us. And as children, we're very open. We're like sponges, and we just take that in, and we are influenced by school afterwards, and society, work, all these different environments kind of put certain beliefs in us. And some of those beliefs are not, positive. They're more negative beliefs. And these are trauma, like generational trauma.
Mm-hmm. And so an example of that might be, so if maybe the idea of criticism or criticizing a loved one to the point of maybe impacting their self-esteem. So if that was done to a parent by their parent, and they're not aware of that pattern, and they're not seeing that there's any reason to really change that, they might pass that on to their own children as a way of parenting. Is that a fair example?
Yeah, that's a great example. And I'd even say, like, in another vein, like if our parent was criticized by their parents, and then they pick a partner who is also prone to criticizing them because that's what they're used to. They're used to being criticized. And then, with this critical partner, like this critical partner is also going to criticize the child. So it's like even this side, the parent who is being criticized also passes down their trauma to the child.
And so when you talk about it as forms of energy, what do you mean? What does that look like in someone? How does it show up in someone, the energy that comes with generational trauma?
Yeah, so it's kind of like we all have a certain energetic or emotional mental state that when we're in.
And emotion is energy, right? I mean, when you're talking about, it's not some far out concept that we're talking about here. Emotion is energy. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So when we're in that state, we kind of identify with it. We think, oh, this is me. Like if we're prone to like being a little sad, or if we're prone to being happier, when we're in that state, we feel that this is the normal state for me. So that's what I mean by energy. It's like
and we
actually,
identify with that, right? I mean, we're saying it's not like, I think this is something I picked up in some Buddhist teachings that I've come across. It's not the difference between I am happy and I have happiness, right? Like I have a feeling of happiness versus I am happy or I am happiness, right?
right, exactly. Like the first one, I have happiness, is like, you're kind of disidentifying with that. But when you're saying, I am happy, then you're just like identifying completely with that emotion. But our emotions actually come from our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
If we stay with like an emotional state, actually beneath that state, there's like a thought, and it
Yeah.
may be subconscious, and we're just not aware that we have that thought.
Yeah, and this is something that I've become more aware of in my own life in recent years because, and I think I was talking about this on another episode recently, in that I have the ability to think thoughts with words in my head. Like I can say complete sentences in my head and think those thoughts in my head with words. Not everybody has that ability.
Mhm.
And but I do also have the ability to, there's a I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a feeling or an energy, for lack of a better term, that represents a thought, right? Like a thought of sadness or thought of anger or thought of shame, but it's not like articulated in words. And I can feel that presence in my body.
Mhm.
Is that what you're kind of referring to?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like most emotions have a thought attached to it. It's just that most people aren't aware, and it's more
They're not aware of it.
subtle. Yeah.
And that's what I was kind of, and that's what I meant, is that I just became aware of those non-word related thoughts
Mhm.
and how much of an impact they've had on my lives, because they've kind of been in the background because they're not really articulated with words in my brain. And so I had a hard time really identifying them, but it had such an impact on me.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so when we become aware
Mhm.
of these thoughts and how they impact our emotions, what does that mean? So what, right?
Right, right. So it's really exciting when we become aware of it, because previously, like when I was talking about the energy, it's like, you don't just have one thought that's causing this energetic, pattern in you. It's like this collection of all these different thoughts, like woven together in like a web,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm.
So this is like basically running the show, right? In
Hmm.
the beginning, when you're not aware of your thoughts, someone says something mean and you immediately get triggered. You're either hurt or angry or, sad, whatever your pattern is, and it just happens. But as you become aware of it, you can notice, oh, like when someone says that to me, I have this thought.
Hmm.
And this thought sends me into like a spiral of negativity.
Hmm.
So if I can reframe this thought, then I can have a healthier relationship to when others are not so kind. And yeah, it's just so exciting when you become aware and become able to work with those subconscious.
Yes. So awareness is that first step, right? And I think that's probably where I am to some degree. But you also mentioned reframing thoughts. This is something it's been suggested to me that I learn how to do. It has been a struggle in learning how to do that. So do you have any insights or any tips for anyone on how to learn how to reframe thoughts if they're struggling to do so? Like, what
Mhm.
is that? First of all, what do we mean? Like, what's an example of reframing a thought, and how do we become good at it?
Right, right. Okay. So I just want to like validate your struggle, because I also have struggled immensely
Yeah.
with reframing my own thoughts.
Mhm.
But after a certain point of going through the same kind of patterns of like, so my pattern was I would reach out to someone like my mentor whenever I was feeling emotionally dysregulated. And I kind of expected her to make me feel regulated again. And then
Mm.
I realized after a while, that doesn't work. I need to regulate myself.
You have to
So,
have the skill internally. Yeah.
right. Like I have to self-soothe.
Yeah.
And I actually downloaded an app called Youper, which is super
How
helpful.
do you spell that?
Youper.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's become more like, it's become worse, actually. It used to be really good, but it's not free anymore, or whatever. But So in that, I would just kind of vent. I would just say
Mhm.
all that I wanted to say and be like, oh, life is terrible, blah, blah,
Yeah, yeah,
blah.
yeah, yeah.
And then they would ask, like, what do you notice about these patterns? And then there were things like victimization. I was victimizing
Mm,
myself,
mm,
all or nothing thinking, blaming
mm-hmm,
others. There were different like patterns that they had. And then I could notice them and, say, oh, like all my thoughts are kind of like, blaming others or whatever.
mm-hmm,
Then they asked, would you like to try to reframe this thought?
mm,
Or do you want to vent more?
mm.
And so usually I was ready to reframe it.
Sure.
Then they would show me my previous thought that I had, which was very negative.
Yeah, yeah,
And then I would be like, okay, you know what? This is like doom and gloom. Of course, I feel bad if I'm like thinking this.
sure.
Instead of thinking like everything's terrible, I could be like, I had a bad day today, but
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow's a new day and I can start feeling better right now. You know,
Interesting.
I'll make myself a cup of tea.
Yeah.
So just that quality of feeling is different from saying like everything's terrible to like, I had a bad day today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So helping to put things in perspective. Okay, so that's a skill that can help you um with the thoughts, especially the negative thoughts that come into play, and then how that makes you feel, the how it shifts the energy in your body. But again, so when we talk about generational trauma and the energy, so these are probably long established patterns that are in us. They're almost habitual, right? And as we said, we may not even be aware of some of them. So what might make someone want to come talk to someone like yourself? I mean, what's the point at which we say, okay, this is enough, or maybe it's different for everybody, but like, how does one become aware that this is too much?
Mm-hmm. I'd say, if you're trying these things on your own, you're probably off to a great start.
Mm-hmm,
But I'd say if you actually aren't able to do this and you're constantly feeling stuck
mm-hmm,
and you don't know why, and you try to, do these exercises and they still don't help,
mm-hmm,
that's when I'd say reach out to someone,
mm-hmm,
either a therapist or a coach. But to be clear, coaching is not therapy. So if
mm-hmm.
you have like major depression or, like BPD or something, I would recommend a therapist.
Sure.
But afterwards, if you kind of have a handle on that and you want to thrive, that's when coaching is,
Mm-hmm.
the way to go.
Right. Awesome. Okay. But if going back to generational trauma, and I think about my own experience and my conversation with my mother
Mhm.
yesterday, it's in my own personal experience, I've had this awareness of things that um, cause pain that are inside of me. Some of them have been caused by the way I was raised, but certainly there were other factors, other environmental factors growing up. But then, in talking with my mother, there were some things that were passed down to her, that she had experienced. And in my experience as an African American, some of this even goes back to the days when we were enslaved, because in particular, this whole thing about um, sort of a topic of discussion sometimes in the Black community about using switches to beat your children, right? A branch from a tree.
Mhm.
Um, but where does that come from, right? It comes from those days probably when we were enslaved, but we passed the pattern down, to different generations
Mhm.
without an understanding of what it really does. Yeah, you may get compliance from a kid in the near term, but in the reality, it's you're embedding something in that child, a form of shaming, a form of violence that then gets passed on to another generation.
Right.
And some of us have, become aware of that imprint and said, okay, is this something I really want to share to the next generation? Is it helpful? Is it useful? Is there a better way?
Mhm.
And so we kind of examined that. But
Yeah.
some things are easier to kind of become aware of on its own. But in other instances, we, as you say, we may struggle with that. We may need some help. But what are some of the things that you can help people do to uncover some of those things that may be a little murky in someone's mind, or maybe they know there's some pain here, but they're having trouble sort of figuring out how to grasp or work with it and move beyond it. How do you help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd say for those really entrenched patterns, what was helpful for me was having a teacher. So because I'm in a Buddhist spiritual tradition, I don't consider myself Buddhist, but I had a teacher who, this teacher had worked through that kind of trauma and everything within himself. So when you're around a spiritual teacher like that, they do have this energetic acceptance.
Mm,
They just have this energy of like peace.
yeah.
And just being around them will kind of bring up my own trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and it will help me be more aware of it and also to let it go easier
Mm-hmm.
than if I'm on my own, or if I'm in like my family environment where I was traumatized, that would be a difficult place to work through trauma,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
would need to be out of there and kind of, in nature, or like around a teacher who's really, worth his salt, or his or her salt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't say that I'm fully, like accepting and everything, but I do feel, generally, that I have worked through a lot of my own traumas. So when I'm around someone, I do find often I am able to help
Mm-hmm.
just by being accepting and just by listening and having that presence
Mm-hmm.
as they work through their own stuff. So it's not like I'm working through it for them. It's like they're working through their stuff, but they have me beside them and I'm just kind of solid,
You
like,
you
uh-huh.
create that environment for them to feel
Yeah,
supported, to feel safe, to feel stable,
right.
which then probably, and I thought your example was great, because you said it's like, well, if you're in your own family environment and that's the source of the trauma, it's kind of hard for you to
Yeah.
come to terms with it,
Yeah.
right? Because you're still being pinged all over the place by all the things that caused the trauma in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you need to be someplace quiet, someplace safe, someplace supportive.
Right.
But you also mentioned in your teacher this degree of acceptance, right?
Mhm.
And then you talk about how you try to offer that to others.
Mhm.
Talk to us about what the acceptance does. What does it mean when we accept? Are we accepting the generational trauma? What are we accepting, and how does that? Why is it so important to accept?
Mm-hmm. Oh wow, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's the first time I've ever been asked that question.
Well,
That's
I have a friend who I talk, because I sort of have been around the fringes of Buddhism myself. I haven't really gone that deep into it, but as an avid meditator, I've learned about acceptance to some degree. I think I'm still learning about it, but I talked to a friend of mine about it one time, and I said to her, "It's like, hey." Some of the relief comes through acceptance. And she was like, oh, no, absolutely not. I can't accept it, that, whatever. Right. So it's like,
right.
because I think in her mind, she thought it was that she was giving into this thing that she didn't like. Right. And that she was, um, uh, acceptance meant surrender, right, to that thing in her life, but surrender in a bad way, like I got to keep fighting against it and I can't surrender to it. So tell us what you mean by acceptance, and why that's so important here.
Right, right. Okay. So I want to make a distinction between acceptance and complicity. So complicity is like what your friend was afraid of, is like, just allowing the abuse to happen or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not that. Acceptance is like just seeing the situation exactly as it is, with its good and bad, and just accepting the situation.
Mm. Mm.
It is like, it is what it is.
Or using what I had heard is a more of a Buddhist frame, is accepting the nature of it. The
Right.
the nature of it, that is just the way that person is or that thing is. It's just their nature.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For example, like if someone is a very, violent person in a family and we struggle against it, I mean, we can change ourselves, but we can't change that person.
Right.
So we need to accept that that person is a violent person. And
Mhm.
people have like really varying reactions to accepting that that person is violent, because I think we don't like to think that other people are bad people.
Mhm.
And if you're a nice, good person,
Mhm.
generally you don't want to say like, oh, that's a violent person.
Mhm.
I'm not saying to judge them. I'm
Well,
saying,
that's the key, right? In what you were saying, because you said it before, it's not about judgment. It's accepting it as it is. You might even say that's not a violent person. You might say that person has violent tendencies, or they react violently in certain situations,
yeah,
right? If we don't
exactly.
like to label people that way. But the acceptance, as you said, is not the same thing as complicit. It doesn't mean you have to be, it doesn't mean you have to invite that person into your life or to keep them around, but you're just accepting that that's their nature, that they have these tendencies.
Right, exactly, exactly. So then if when you're able to accept that, it's kind of like AA. Like
Mm.
I've never been to AA, but I've heard about it. And it's like that moment when the person who is addicted to a substance accepts that they are addicted. That's the moment that change can happen.
Mm.
So before that, when they don't accept it, they always are kind of like shaming themselves or
Hmm. Yeah.
judging themselves
Yeah.
or blaming, or and these emotions are stopping them from actually changing the pattern.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's why acceptance is necessary for change.
Yeah. Yeah. I started listening to an Audible book over the weekend
Mhm.
called How Can I Forgive You? And it's an awesome book because I think it's, a lot of books that talk about forgiveness, for me, they tend to be a bit uh theoretical or just too pie in the sky, and maybe there's a religious component to it that doesn't really connect with me. But
Mhm.
this is a very practical book, and they talk about four levels of or the author, excuse me, Janice Abrams Spring, talks about four levels of forgiveness. And the first one is that where you are complicit in the process and you're kind of just blindly saying, I think she calls it blind forgiveness, is where you're kind of saying that you forgive the person, but really you're still complying and being complicit in what's happening, right? The things that are hurting you.
Uh-huh.
And I forgot what the second level was, but the third level, before you get to true forgiveness, which is the fourth level, the third level is acceptance. And
Mhm.
it just really just blew my mind as I was hearing her explain what that was. And it's a lot of what we're talking about here, which is you're accepting the nature of it. And the forgiveness comes in the form of just that, like you said, that awareness that comes from just saying, I understand that this is the way that person is or the way that situation is. I'm not going to put any other judgment on. I'm just going to accept that that happened or that person is doing those things
Yeah.
and then move on it. And then you say that this sort of allows us to move on, or to some degree, right, to a different step in the process, right? So what happens after this? So after we have the awareness and after we sort of had the acceptance, what happens after that?
Mhm. Yeah. So once you're aware and then you accept it, actually, complete acceptance is forgiveness,
Mm.
but it's hard to do, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
like
yeah,
to see the situation exactly as it is,
yeah.
accept it and move on. That is really hard to do. So,
And it may be a process. It's not like a
yeah,
instant thing. Yeah.
yes, it's like a recursive process. Like you go back, like you feel like you've accepted it, you go back to blaming, and then you're
Mhm.
like, oh, I still have this anger.
Yes,
You just,
yes.
yeah. But something I'd recommend if someone is having a hard time accepting is first to have compassion for yourself.
Mm.
So don't try to accept the people who did wrong to you, because being angry is natural.
Yes.
It's okay to be angry.
Yes.
Like, I think, in a lot of mental health stuff, like, we're like, let go of your anger. But if you're at the stage where you're angry, just be angry.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
fine, because an injustice has been, perpetrated.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay to be angry about that. That's
Well,
natural.
we have the ability to be angry because it helps protect us, right? There are instances where the anger helps protect us. And so I think it's the persistence of it and the degree of it that makes it a problem, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're then taking that anger and taking it out on people and, being violent yourself,
Yeah.
that's the part where you should be like, oh, well,
Goes too far. Yeah.
that's too far.
Yeah.
But if you're angry, like, just the emotion, you shouldn't shame yourself for having that emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so usually anger comes from a place of deep hurt
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and very deep vulnerability.
Yeah.
So, like, in childhood, something
Mm-hmm.
happened, and then you were at a very, weak point in your life. When you're a child, all the adults in your life are like 3 times as big as you.
Yeah. Yeah.
and and you're weak. Like, you need protection, and things that happen in that period, like, it's unjust, and that anger comes from, the feeling of powerlessness,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm.
feeling of, like, you know, like, I can't articulate it right now, but, like, if you're feeling this in your body as you're listening, like,
Yeah.
we all have those moments when
Sure.
we're unjust. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're coming to terms with these difficult emotions in us. So
Mhm.
what happens there? What would you recommend that people do after that if you're working with them?
Mhm, mhm. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to listen to this spiritual teacher named Adya Shanti. So his name is Adyashanti.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it means primordial peace. So he
Ah,
took that name. Uh-huh.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I'm listening to a teacher like that, as I'm working through my difficult emotions, it brings a sense of peace to my turbulence.
Okay.
So if you don't have a resource like that, or if you're not comfortable listening to spiritual teachers, then I'd say let go of the anger for a moment and feel into where there is already peace in your body.
Mm.
So where is it already, full of ease or happy or just, calm?
Yeah.
And then feel into that. And then as the anger comes up, try to tap into that feeling of peace as the anger comes up or the other emotions are coming up.
So is this somatic therapy or is this somatic healing that you're describing? Because it sounds very similar. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Because it's so funny because I just started learning about that about a week ago too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, there's that process of I guess there's one TED talk that I saw talked about the shifting of your attention from that place of peace in your body to that where you sense, where, like, let's say if you're your left leg, I'm just picking a spot, and there's a sense of peace and relaxation and calm in that part of your body, but then you notice that perhaps your emotion is showing up in your shoulders and it's tight and it feels angry and it's hot. And it's like turning your attention back and forth between those two areas. I don't fully still understand how that works, but it can help you to regulate what's going on in your body a bit, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And It's kind of okay. So the feeling of peace in Buddhism is associated with the concept of emptiness.
Mm,
And emptiness is not like a cup that's empty.
yeah.
In Buddhism, the concept is actually like intrinsic emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
So just like we said, like we appear solid, but we're actually energetic
Mm-hmm.
and we have more free space within us than matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. Like there's an interdependence,
Mm.
like what caused me to be in this world.
Yes. Yeah.
And so intrinsically, I am empty of, I mean, this can be disturbing for some people, but
Yeah.
I'm empty of meaning. I'm empty of substance.
Yeah.
And so this empty space is the place where peace comes from and the place where happiness comes from.
Mm.
It's like,
Interesting.
yeah, it's like the silence is where everything comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So by feeling into that silence, we can kind of take our, anger or negative emotions back to that kind of primordial place
Mm-hmm.
of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And, when these two meet, it's like, it's kind of like if we think of emptiness as light and, the emotions as darkness,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the light is bringing light to that darkness
Yeah.
and kind of dissolving it.
So I can hear and understand at a high level what you're saying. This is new to me, so it's a little bit hard for me to digest. Um, so I'm trying to connect it back to, we started this process with or this conversation talking about generational trauma, and we're talking about how to process it, right? The steps and sort of things that we can do to help us process it. This one I'm struggling with just really understanding how to work with that, or how to make that real in my own life if I chose to.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any additional examples or insights that you could share
Yeah.
about how that works? Yeah. The
Yeah.
emptiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so it's like this is why we meditate, because
Mm,
meditation is a space of silence in our world, which is often like so full of noise and busy. In meditation, we're silent.
yeah.
And that's why people don't like to meditate, right? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's boring and there's thoughts, like I'm the same way, honestly.
Yeah.
Like when
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's like, okay, what's happening now? You know, but that silence is the original state.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Okay.
And when we're in that original state, all of the past traumas kind of come up.
Mm.
And
This is what you were calling Vipassana, right? The insight meditation. Is that right?
right.
Which may be different than mindfulness meditation, right? In terms of how you do it.
Yeah, actually, this is mindfulness meditation.
Oh,
Even
it
in
is. Okay.
mindfulness meditation,
Yeah.
like a lot of people say, silence makes me nervous. Like in
Mm,
conversation, if there's a silence,
mm.
people get nervous because
Yeah.
they're like, oh
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And it's that it's those patterns in us of
Hmm.
like, I have to be busy, or
Right.
like I have to work, I have to say something, whatever,
Is that a way of drowning out the discomfort, like
Yeah,
avoiding, the uncomfortable nature of things? Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So as you come to peace within yourself, the more comfortable you become with silence. So if you're in a state of like a lot of dysregulation, silence is going to be very disturbing.
yeah. Yeah.
All of that's going to come up.
Yeah.
But as you become more peaceful within yourself, you'll notice that you're more comfortable with everyone just being quiet.
But the becoming more comfortable with it, is that the acceptance that we were talking about earlier? That's just the because I think when I've done mindfulness, or when I practice on a daily basis, um, one of the things I had learned when I first learned how to practice mindfulness was it's the exact opposite of what a lot of us are taught, which is like you have the emotions, you suppress them, you avoid them, you push them down. And mindfulness, you're trying to feel everything, like you literally just diving into embracing it, trying to put some compassion around it, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's such a foreign I mean, it's like literally I feel like I'm training myself every day to learn how to do that. I do feel like it helps me to become a better person, but it isn't easy because it's not like that first, at least it hasn't been the way that I've been trained to behave, right? Um, and so it takes some it's like practicing anything else. It becomes you develop the habit through practice.
Mhm.
Um and so yes, I can understand what you're saying when you sort of these difficult sensations in your body, the difficult emotions, the energies start showing up in that quiet space. It's like, what do you do with them?
Right.
For me, I've just learned how to just allow them to be there and feel them and try to embrace them with compassion. I don't know if that's the path that you're suggesting, but that's what I've tried to do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's exactly what I'm suggesting because a lot of people they have this misconception of meditation as like I have to try to be peaceful.
Yeah, or I have to I can't. Someone said to me one time when I was
Oh,
teaching meditation, it's like I can't quiet my brain. It's like, well, it's not supposed to be quiet, and it's never going to be quiet, right? It's like
right.
we have to learn how to work with that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think like you're already at the stage where you're accepting it,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, that's the acceptance. You're right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
So going back to the generational trauma, I think part of the acceptance comes about in, as you had said previously, of with the acceptance comes our ability to stop blaming ourselves. Is that fair, or is that the connection there?
Yeah, I have to say, I am not at the stage where I can not blame anyone and not blame myself.
Sure,
Right.
sure.
So, well,
During degrees, maybe.
yes, yes. Actually, I've never really blamed myself, but I'd say like if I feel angry, I do kind
Mhm.
of feel like, oh, I shouldn't be angry. But really, in that moment, that thought, like I shouldn't be angry.
That's shaming yourself for being angry, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so like the complete acceptance would be not blaming others, not blaming myself, just accepting every situation as it is. And actually, this is the state that in Buddhism is called enlightenment.
Yes. Ah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, Jesus,
Hmm.
in Christianity, like when he was on the cross, he
Hmm.
said, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah.
That's complete acceptance. And
Acceptance. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, you know, it, I shouldn't even say it's really hard to do, right?
Well,
Because
no, you should say it is hard to do. And it is, and I think the thing that's become clear to me, is especially as I've gone through this podcast and in looking at my own life, is that the key to all of this is the relationship to self. Literally, you're developing a relationship to yourself. And what that means is that just like a relationship with a person is like, just because they did something to you that was harmful, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're just ready to forgive them and it's done and it's clear and everything else. It can be a process. As you say, you may go through these, depending on what happened to you, maybe bouts of anger to acceptance to anger to sadness to, different degrees as you work through. And it's a process. And I think we process these things with ourselves too. Um, and so that point about saying to yourself, well, you shouldn't be angry. Okay, but then you're able to say, oh, well, okay, I should allow myself the space to be angry because I am. All right. And like you said, that creates the alignment, the inner alignment that actually gives you that feeling of peace because
yeah,
you're being okay with yourself.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So, yeah, so actually, acceptance is a complete balance between recognizing the reality. So, for like, let me make it less like
Mm-hmm.
conceptual and coming back to the anger. If someone did something bad to you, um, acceptance would be, okay, they did this. And you would have compassion for yourself and for the other person, because actually the degree of compassion you have for yourself and acceptance you have for yourself is the degree to which you can accept and be compassionate to others.
Yes. Yes.
So you would recognize your own pain in being the victim of whatever happened, but you would also recognize the other person's pain be equal to your own. Because either they're just going around being awful to people,
Yeah.
and there's a pain associated with that because they can't have good relationships,
Yeah.
or they're doing this because they're coming from a place of pain inside themselves as well.
Yes. Yes. I think I remember as a kid, I'd read, I think it was in Sports Illustrated, and there was a track star. I think it was Wilma Rudolph. But I could be wrong on who the person was, and somebody probably in the audience will correct me. But she had been called, a racial epithet, Black woman, and I think somebody had asked her, like, "Oh my gosh, how does that make you feel? It must have been horrible." And she said something to the effect of, "Well, actually, I feel sorry for that person." It's like, how could you feel sorry for that person? And she said something to the effect of, because that person is in a whole lot of pain, right? To be able to say something like that to me, right? You talk about a reframe. That's a reframe right there. But it's also very insightful, because what she was understanding is the humanity of that other person, in that this is somebody who was acting out the inner damage that they had on other people. And but she recognized that, and she wasn't going to allow that to get inside of her as a result of that, right? The recognition of it allowed her to stop it and keep it outside of her. So
Yeah. And I'd say, like, she's really an empowered person as well, because she didn't take that on.
yeah.
Like, that action that the other person did, it's not about me.
Yeah.
Like, it's about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's real power. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we only have a few minutes left, Jenna. I really appreciate you coming, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the book that you've written, the Heavenly Creatures. That's it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us about the book, and why did you write it?
Okay, so this book is a spiritual fiction book, and I wrote it because I wanted to show the kind of transition in my thinking from religious philosophical thinking to more non-dual spiritual thinking, which is associated with like Buddhism and like, Adyashanti, the spiritual teacher, and then like emptiness and all that.
And so what is non-dualism again?
Non-dualism is when the subject and object disappear, and we recognize the oneness of all phenomena.
So maybe another way of saying is that God is within each of us, as
Yeah.
opposed to God being a separate being.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So dualism, I guess, is where there's a man and a God, or a human and a God, right? And then
yes.
non-dualism is we're all one and God is in us.
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So I wanted to show like how that transition happened in my own thinking, and to hopefully have it be helpful in other people's dealing with their trauma. So the story is about like a bodhisattva who has 2 past lifetimes where
And a bodhisattva is a Buddhist teacher?
a bodhisattva is one who incarnates in order to aid others.
Got it. Okay.
And so this person in the first life, like, well, actually, I won't get into it. You can read about it.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
but tell us about the connection to your life. I mean, give them a sense for what would make them want to, what would they see if they actually picked up your book and read it?
So it's about past lives, But for me personally, I don't know if past lives are real or not.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was meditating and studying, working through my own trauma, things did come up that seemed to suggest that past lives were real,
Mm-hmm.
which sparked writing this book. And
Mm.
then in the book, Bodhisattva has 2 past lifetimes, which were very traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
So in one of them, she was abandoned by her mother and died. And then in another, like she was reborn as a soldier, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, this trauma she's like working through this spiritual study of like
Mm-hmm.
going from religion to the non-dual spirituality.
Okay. And then does the person find a form of enlightenment? Do they feel like they've moved on to a place of peace, or like, or we
Yes.
don't want to give away the ending, but yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I wouldn't say the person comes to full enlightenment,
Okay.
but she's getting there at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. But I think what you're saying here is, and I just made a note to myself that when we talk about resolving or working through trauma, you know, in a lot of cases, and especially in our society, it is about we focus a lot on the cognitive nature of things, and that can help, right? And it can be helpful for some people, but that emotion is energy, and energy is spirit, right? And so going at it from a spiritual realm is also a possibility too.
Yes.
So they all, as you say, are all interconnected. So anyway, Jenna, thank you so much for being here today. I love your humility. Yours, you know, you really could just express so much more about what you have to offer, but I know that's not who you are. So but it's wonderful what you shared with us, and I really appreciate it, and really loved having you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I do hope that what I shared was helpful. Most of my experience has been in the spirituality, so I wanted to keep it more like scientific and
well, but I guess what you did, and I think it's helpful, is it helps show the connection between all of these things, right? Because sometimes we think it's like, well, I don't want to go down a spiritual path for this, and it may work for some people, or they may say, well, I don't want to go down the cognitive path. But the point is that there are multiple paths to be able to help people overcome these things. And that's actually why I wanted to do this show, is to show people that there are many different ways to go at it. So thank you for helping contribute to that conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you were able to take some inspiration or something of value from today's show. To access all of the resources and links mentioned, please head on over to copeandchill.com or our video-based podcast on our YouTube channel at Cope and Chill, where you will find the show notes for today's episode. That's Cope and Chill, CopeandChill.com. And for information about upcoming episodes, check us out on Instagram at Cope and Chill. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're joining us from YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're joining us from. Please come back and join us again for next week's episode. But until then, take care of yourselves.